Very quick. I want to thank the Academy for putting on this event today and to acknowledge that we are standing on Whadjuk Noongar land and to say and to acknowledge the wisdom of elders past, present and emerging. So the question of social change, everybody has looked at that question today and talked a bit about how their research can forward social change or interrogate social change. My talk is about the failure of change. And so I'm going to be reflecting that a bit over my own professional history. So the organisers asked us to reflect on what was the core question. And so I thought, okay, well, what's my core question? My core question is, how do we reform the police for a democracy? And I took this question to Indonesia, where the dictator had just fallen, so we had a military dictatorship, and in 1998, that dictatorship was transitioned to become a democracy, and with that transition came a change of our coercive forces. So it was a military dictatorship before, and this meant in 1998 the military were going to go back to barracks, and the police were going to take control of security, order, law enforcement. And so my question became, okay, so how do we reform the police in line with this new political regime? And when I started studying this question in the sort of 2000s, it was a very lonely field for a political scientist. There weren't many political scientists interested in that question, unlike today, where I think we're seeing an absolute resurgence in it. So, and at the time, not only were there not many political scientists, but the question of police reform was a very bespoke question, in the sense that there weren't people marching on the streets for police reform. There were people marching on the streets to get rid of the military, but there wasn't a kind of broad social movement sort of articulating what they wanted in terms of policing. Instead, that seemed to be, the question of police reform was a very technical question, a very administrative question, a question of public administration, and a question of law. So the first part of this police reform became a question of, well, we need to adjust the constitution, and so we bring in the constitutional lawyers or the constitutional scholars, and we need to write the legislation for the police. If we get the right legislation, then we'll get the right police. And so it became a question of change being driven by a particular group, by legislators, by attorney generals, by ministers and police administrators and legal scholars. So the question of how we reform the police sort of invited a particular kind of audience who gave us a particular legalistic kind of answer. And I was, well entrenched in this as well. I was really interested in comparative policing law and how do we write the right law and look what they do in Brazil and all these sorts of things, right? And so what we got was this new police legislation. We got a new commission of the police. We got a whole flurry of work to build this sort of legal architecture and the procedures and the regulations around the police. We engaged in kind of study tours to other countries to see how they set up their police legislatively. And so once we got our kind of police in law, we could sort of sit back and say, well, are we there yet? Have we reformed our police yet? But yet, of course, we had not. There was a whole institution, a new workforce to train, to engage with, and to engage into this question of democratic police reform. And so this question became no longer how do we reform the police, but became how do we reform the police to be professional, to kind of match these new laws that we've established. And again, when you frame the question in a particular way, you get a particular kind of audience. So then we had police experts come from all around the world. We had, they often tended to be police themselves, became sort of these global police consultants who trafficked in this kind of global industry of police reform. And they brought these ideas of what global policing looked like and what professionalised policing looked like. They tended to be from a few specific countries, like the US or the UK. There were a few Australians there as well. And they brought ideas like new curriculum or study tours or masters and PhD programs, or there was one program which brought iPads onto police boats. I don't know why, but it was considered to be quite a good police reform program. And these were all sort of very well paid consultants sharing their knowledge of what a developed police would look like for the developing world. And again, after this rush, the many millions of dollars spent, we could ask the question, are we there yet? Do we have our reformed professional police yet? And the answer, if you looked around you, was no. Sort of 10 years into reform, we saw a police that was deeply brutal, that was very, very corrupt, that in many ways had stepped into the role of the military and inherited their power. So for all the millions and millions spent on these police programs, for all the energy that development and legal scholars and Parliament had put into reforming the police, if you asked an ordinary person, you know, what do you think about your police? They have a kind of a saying. They would say, well, if you report a chicken, you'll lose a goat, meaning if you go anywhere near the police, it'll cost you more to operate with them, and it's best to give them a wide berth. So then we had a new kind of wave of police reform. How do we get a more human rights orientated, a more community embedded police? And that invited again a different kind of audience, an audience that I also joined. And NGOs, global NGOs, local NGOs became very involved with this problem of police reform. And they brought with them a grab bag of reformist ideas, rewriting use of force policies, firearms storage policies, different kinds of police formations in a public order demonstration, what's a kind of pro-human rights police formation to take in a demonstration. They brought with them trainings on women's and children's units, trainings on police and community relations, new human rights curriculum. And NGOs and police activists were deeply embedded with the police. And they found often that this relationship was very fragile, was very tenuous. It was often one fractured by mistrust. And so there was a lot of work that came with this process of engagement. And we've talked a lot about engagement. And I think the NGO situation shows us how difficult reform can be, how difficult it can be to bring different parties to the table. And one of the problems now, reflecting back on this kind of wave of human rights orientated policing, was when there was an incident or a scandal for policing, the NGOs who were treading this icy water with their relationships with the police couldn't respond. They couldn't critique the police if there was a human rights incident. And what that meant, a little bit, as Kelly has talked to us about, is that the social movement or the social forces outside the police putting pressure on reform had evaporated. Without the NGOs, they were all embedded, and it meant that the outside push factors had disappeared. So in that context, it was really unclear who had changed who. And in fact, if anything, with the kind of kneecapping of the human rights organisations, it seemed that the police were even stronger and more authoritative and coercive than before. So we have this paradox in which police reform, and Alex Vitale argues, in fact, police reform rewards the police with new projects, new budget lines, new activities, new resources, and it's becoming increasingly evident that police reform as a project both in Indonesia and elsewhere has failed. If we look at the US, we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, we look at Banksia Hill, we look at Queensland. The question of how do we reform the police for a democracy is vital everywhere, is being questioned again everywhere, not just in developing world countries like Indonesia. And so it comes to me, and I'm going to conclude, but the question of what skills does social science bring to this problem? Because it's a problem that we didn't fix, regardless of the very different approaches we tried to take over decades and decades and decades. And I think that for me, the skill I can bring is the ability to detach, to bring my critical thinking skills, as Tobias talked about, and to think about this problem differently. And to think that maybe the question is not how do we reform the police for democracy, but what kinds of problems are we looking to resolve and trying to untangle them from criminal justice systems and logics of policing, and understanding them as only tangentially connected to those institutions and to those logics, and to see them actually as social problems. And when we start to think about the core problems that police manage and deal with every day, like domestic violence or youth disaffection, these aren't really problems for the police. These are problems that are entangled with the police. Why are we expecting to reform an institution that is fundamentally incapable of dealing with these core social problems? And so now I think, as a social scientist of the police, I argue quite provocatively in some environments for the dismantlement of the police and for us to rethink some of these core issues of policing. Do we need the police for some of these issues? And it's not to say that we don't need coercion or we don't need public order or that the police should be completely eradicated, but that maybe we should be rethinking our core approach to issues that are fundamentally social issues. And if you think about when the state really has big issues that it wants to deal with, money laundering, corruption, it doesn't ask the police to take on that work. It sets up its own agency. And that usually tends to be a multi-skilled agency that has police involved, but involves other kinds of social sciences as well. And I wonder if we think of a world post-police, it's these kinds of agencies and institutional forms that we might turn to. Thanks very much.